He offered his sandwich to a young alien woman, unaware she ruled the galaxy. The bustling spaceport on Epsilon 9 was a kaleidoscope of activity. Ships from all corners of the galaxy landed and took off in a constant cycle. The air was thick with the hum of engines, the chatter of traders, travelers, and diplomats, all speaking in different languages, each accent distinct. Amid this chaos, Marcus, a simple human traveler from Earth, sat at a bench near the food court, sipping from a bottle of water and observing the crowd. Marcus had never been one for the spotlight. His life had always been about moving from place to place, taking on odd jobs to fund his next adventure. He wasn't a diplomat, nor did he have any grand ambitions. He was just a man trying to see the stars and experience the wonders of the galaxy, without getting tangled in the politics or power struggles that seemed to plague so many other travelers. Today he had a sandwich in his hand, nothing fancy, just a quick snack he'd grabbed before boarding his next transport to a distant mining colony. He was in no rush. As the ship wouldn't depart for another couple of hours, he found himself more curious than usual about the people around him. His eyes wandered, drawn to a young woman sitting alone at the edge of the busy terminal. Unlike most of the travelers, she seemed out of place. While the others were lost in conversations or buried in their data pads, she was watching the crowd intently, her posture straight and dignified. Her skin was a striking shade of violet, smooth and almost luminous under the artificial lighting. Her long, dark hair was tied back loosely, but it was the intensity in her glowing eyes that caught Marcus's attention. They seemed to shimmer with an inner light, as though she could see things others could not. There was something about her that intrigued him. She didn't belong to any of the familiar species Marcus had encountered in his travels. She was different, and yet she seemed lonely. He couldn't help but notice how, despite her striking appearance, she remained completely isolated. No one approached her, no one seemed to pay her any attention, and she didn't seem to mind the solitude. Marcus thought about it for a moment. In a spaceport like this, loneliness wasn't all that unusual. Many travelers, especially the high-ranking ones, preferred to keep to themselves. But there was something more to this young woman's isolation. It wasn't just that she was alone. It was as if she was carrying a weight no one else could understand. He couldn't help it. It was just who he was, a person who found it hard to ignore when others were in need of kindness, even in the smallest form. He stood up from his bench and walked over to her. "Hey," he said with a friendly smile, holding out the half-eaten sandwich he had been nibbling on. "I've got a sandwich here if you're hungry." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes locked, and he saw a flicker of surprise in her gaze. But the moment passed quickly, and she glanced down at the sandwich, then back at him. "I'm not hungry, thank you," she replied softly, her voice smooth, almost melodic. It was the kind of voice that seemed to carry a hidden weight, but also a softness, a gentleness. "But I appreciate the offer." Marcus shrugged and took a seat beside her anyway, not wanting to make her feel uncomfortable. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. He wasn't one for small talk, but something about her presence made him want to speak. "So where are you headed?" he asked casually, his eyes scanning the terminal again. "Seems like there are a lot of ships coming and going today. You in a hurry?" The woman's gaze shifted away from him, looking out over the crowd, but she didn't seem to be focusing on anything in particular. "No," she replied after a moment, her tone distant. "Not in a hurry." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the distant sounds of ships landing and takeoff announcements. Marcus didn't press further, sensing that she didn't want to share much about herself. He wasn't bothered by it. He wasn't one to force a conversation if it wasn't wanted. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, he noticed something strange. The people around them were avoiding them, not in a direct way, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible manner. People would glance toward them and then quickly look away, as if sensing some unspoken boundary. It wasn't just the usual lack of attention that he had come to expect in busy spaceports. It was something else, something more deliberate. He was about to ask her if she'd noticed it too when a group of well-dressed individuals walked past, their faces turning cold as they eyed Marcus and the woman. There were two men, tall and broad, flanking a woman who seemed to exude an air of authority. They didn't acknowledge Marcus at all, but the way they glanced at the young woman with such reverence made something click in Marcus's mind. He hadn't thought much about it before, but now it was clear. There was something different about this woman, something important. As the group passed by, Marcus made a mental note to himself. Who is she? The moment passed, and the group vanished into the crowd. He turned his attention back to the young woman, but this time, something in her expression had shifted. It wasn't that she was smiling, but there was a faint sense of amusement in her gaze as she looked at him. "You seem curious," she said, her voice carrying an edge of something he couldn't quite place. It was as though she had caught him off guard, as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. "I am," Marcus admitted, a little embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to stare." "No offense taken," she replied, her lips curving slightly. "It's not often someone approaches me this way." Marcus smiled back, sensing that there was something more to her than just her appearance. There was a quiet strength about her, a presence that seemed to command attention without asking for it. And yet there was something almost vulnerable in the way she carried herself. "Well, you seem like you could use a friend," he said with a shrug, half joking but also serious. "I know how it feels to be far from home and feel a little out of place." For a brief moment she regarded him in silence, her eyes unreadable. Then, without warning, she nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "I suppose we all have our burdens," she said softly. Marcus didn't press her for more. He knew when to leave well enough alone. But as they sat there in the hum of the spaceport, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just met someone who was far more than she appeared. After a moment, she stood, her motion fluid and graceful. She gave him one last glance, her gaze intense yet fleeting. "I must go," she said simply, as if it was a foregone conclusion. Marcus nodded, rising to his feet as well. "Take care," he said. "Maybe I'll see you around." She didn't answer immediately, as if she were contemplating his words. Then, with a slight bow of her head, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Marcus stood there for a moment, watching her go. There was a lingering sense of something he couldn't quite grasp. Who was she? Little did he know, his simple act of kindness would set a series of events in motion that would change his life forever. The days that followed Marcus's brief encounter with the violet-skinned woman were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of life in the galaxy. He made his way to the mining colony on the far edge of Epsilon 9, taking on some minor jobs and enjoying the routine of life among the miners. However, despite his busy schedule, there was something that lingered in his mind: the woman. Her face, her eyes, the quiet way she had carried herself in the spaceport, it all seemed to haunt him. Marcus had met many different species in his travels, but none quite like her. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, looking back, there was an air of mystery about her. He couldn't quite place it, but he knew he hadn't imagined the strange reaction people had when they walked by her. It wasn't until later that he would begin to understand just how much more she was than just another traveler in the galaxy. It was 2 weeks before Marcus saw her again. He was back in the spaceport, having just finished a contract on a nearby ship, and he had a few hours before his next transport arrived. He wandered through the terminal, his mind still half on the work he'd just completed, when he noticed a commotion up ahead. Several individuals in expensive, formal attire were walking through the terminal, flanked by guards in sleek black uniforms. Their presence was enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. Marcus couldn't help but glance over at the group. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her. There she was, walking with the group, but this time her posture was different. She wasn't alone. The dignitaries and the guards seemed to be following her lead, not the other way around. It took a moment for Marcus to realize the truth. She wasn't just some traveler after all. The young woman from the bench, the one he had offered a sandwich to, wasn't just an ordinary alien. She wasn't just someone traveling incognito. She was important, far more important than Marcus could have ever imagined. As she passed by, her eyes briefly met his. She didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him, but something in her gaze told Marcus that she recognized him. There was no smile, no wave, no sign of familiarity, only a cold, distant glance that sent a chill down his spine. Suddenly it all clicked. The way the group had treated him earlier, the way they had avoided him, the strange reverence they held for her, everything made sense now. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was the empress of the galactic empire. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. How could he have not realized it sooner? The way she carried herself, the way everyone around her seemed to defer to her. He had been so caught up in his own thoughts that he hadn't connected the dots. The strange group that had passed by him, their posture, their uniforms, their level of authority, it all made sense now. They weren't just any dignitaries, they were her closest advisors, her personal security detail. The weight of the situation hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. He had offered his sandwich to the ruler of the galaxy without even knowing it. His simple, humble gesture, a gesture meant to be kind, to show sympathy, had been completely out of place. She was the Empress, a figure of immense power and authority. And he, a simple traveler, had acted as if they were equals. Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment rise to his face. He had been so naive, so unaware. But then again, he wasn't the type to worry about status or power. He never had been. It wasn't until that moment, staring after her as she disappeared into the crowd, that he truly understood the weight of the encounter. But there was something more that lingered in his mind. The way she had looked at him, there had been no anger in her eyes, no sign that she resented the gesture. It was as though she were amused, as if his offering, so simple and humble, had been a curiosity, a puzzle for her to figure out. Was she angry with him? He couldn't tell. There was no way of knowing. He hadn't even meant to draw her attention, yet here he was, thinking about it more than he should. That evening, as he boarded his transport to another planet, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just met an important person. He had met someone who was more than he could have ever imagined. He couldn't understand why, but something told him that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The next morning, Marcus was still deep in thought when he received an unexpected communication. He sat up on his bunk, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess of sleep, and answered the call. A familiar voice greeted him, soft, calm, and yet full of a strange authority. "Marcus," the voice said, almost as if it knew him. "It's been a while." His heart skipped. It was her, the young woman from the spaceport, but this time there was no hesitation in her tone. She was speaking as though they had met 100 times before, as though they were old acquaintances. "Empress Lyra," Marcus stammered, shocked by the suddenness of the contact. "How did you?" "I have my ways," she replied coolly, though there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "But I was curious, you seemed different from the others I meet. Most people don't offer their food to strangers. I wanted to thank you for your kindness." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The most powerful ruler in the galaxy was thanking him for a sandwich. I didn't mean to. I didn't know you were." "Who you are," Marcus said, fumbling for the right words. I just thought you seemed like you could use some company." There was a pause on the other end, and Marcus could practically hear the smile in her voice. "I'm rarely offered company, Marcus. That's what makes your gesture so rare." The conversation was brief, and after a few moments of awkward exchange, she signed off, leaving Marcus staring at the blank screen in disbelief. He had spoken to the Empress of the Galaxy, and what's more, she seemed interested in him. But why? What had made him stand out among the millions of beings in the galaxy? What had made his offer of a sandwich so significant? Marcus didn't know the answers to those questions. All he knew was that his life was about to change. Over the following weeks, Marcus couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his chest ever since his brief conversation with Empress Lyra. It was not just that he had met someone so important. It was that she seemed to see something in him that he couldn't quite understand. Despite the vast difference in their status, despite her power and authority, there was a connection, however small, that lingered between them. It wasn't something he had sought, but he felt its pull all the same. His life on Epsilon 9 returned to its usual rhythm. He worked 8 and traveled from one place to another just as he always had. But every time he stepped into a new spaceport or crossed paths with other travelers, his mind would wander back to the violet-eyed woman. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, but that was exactly what happened 2 weeks after their brief communication. One morning, while Marcus was enjoying a cup of coffee in a local cafe, a small, sleek messenger drone floated toward him. It beeped twice and hovered just above his table, where a thin, delicate piece of paper slipped out from a compartment on its side. He took it, unfurling it to reveal elegant writing in a language that he couldn't immediately recognize. The paper was a formal invitation. It was an invitation to meet the Empress, to attend a gathering aboard a royal vessel, one of the most prestigious ships in the entire galactic empire. The note was brief and polite, written in the same tone as the one she had used during their brief communication. There was no explanation, no reason given for why he had been invited. At first, Marcus thought it was a mistake. After all, he was just a traveler, a man with no real standing in the grand scheme of things. What could someone like him possibly have to offer the Empress? But curiosity gnawed at him, and after some time spent weighing the possibility, he made up his mind. He would go. It wasn't every day that a humble traveler received an invitation from the ruler of the galaxy. When the day arrived, Marcus found himself standing in the luxurious boarding hall of the royal vessel. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Gleaming floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with intricate designs and patterns from various parts of the galaxy. The ship itself, the Cerulean Majesty, was a masterpiece of engineering, its exterior sleek and radiant under the stars. Marcus had expected some sort of formal gathering, a meeting of politicians or dignitaries where he would be an outsider. But to his surprise, when he entered the lavishly decorated hall, the room was nearly empty. There were only a handful of people present, most of them in military uniforms or finely tailored attire. They gave him polite nods, but no one spoke. The room was filled with an uneasy silence, as though it were waiting for something. Then, without warning, the doors at the far end of the hall slid open, and there she was. Empress Lyra stepped in, her presence filling the room. She was dressed in a flowing gown made of some iridescent fabric that shimmered in the light. Her violet skin glowed softly under the illumination, and her eyes, those strange, glowing eyes, seemed to pierce the room, looking right through everyone and everything. Marcus's heart raced as he stood there, unsure of what to do. He had never been in the presence of royalty before, let alone the most powerful ruler in the galaxy. He had expected to feel intimidated, but there was something about her calm demeanor that put him at ease. Despite the formal setting, she didn't seem to have the cold, distant air that many high-ranking figures did. There was a warmth to her, something that made Marcus feel like she was just another person, not a figurehead of an empire. "Marcus," she said, her voice gentle yet commanding. It was the same voice from their previous conversation, though now it seemed even more resonant, as though it carried the weight of the galaxy with it. "I'm glad you could join me." He nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. "Your Majesty," he managed to say, bowing slightly, though it felt out of place. "I'm honored by the invitation." Empress Lyra gave him a small, knowing smile. "Please, there is no need for formalities. We are not in a palace, and I would prefer to speak as equals today." Her words, though casual, carried a gravity that made Marcus feel as if they were indeed equals, at least for this moment. She gestured for him to follow her, and he did, feeling like he was walking in a dream. They made their way to a large table where a few other figures were already seated, some of whom Marcus recognized as diplomats from other planets. The room had a peaceful, almost intimate feel to it. The conversation that followed was light, casual, small talk about trade agreements, the weather on various planets, the struggles of maintaining peace in a galaxy that was constantly on the brink of war. As the hours passed, Marcus realized just how different Lyra was from the image of a cold, detached ruler. She seemed genuinely interested in hearing from others, asking questions, listening to their stories. She wasn't merely a figurehead. She was a person who cared deeply about the galaxy, about its people. Her presence wasn't oppressive, but empowering. And yet, through it all, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. While she spoke with such authority, there was an undertone of sadness in her voice, something that couldn't be masked by her words. Every time the conversation turned to her empire, her eyes would flicker with a kind of hidden sorrow. She was the ruler of an entire galaxy, and yet there was something lonely about her. After a while, the other guests began to leave, one by one, until it was just Marcus and the Empress. The two of them remained alone at the table, the dimming lights casting long shadows across the room. "I've enjoyed our conversation," Lyra said, her voice quieter now, as though the weight of the evening had caught up with her. "Most people I meet are interested in my power, my position. They don't ask about my thoughts or my feelings. It's rare to meet someone who simply listens." Marcus nodded, unsure of how to respond. I don't know what to say, really. I'm just a traveler. I don't know anything about ruling a galaxy." Lyra smiled faintly. "You don't need to, but you know what it's like to be ordinary, to not be expected to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He thought about her words, and something deep inside him stirred. He had spent his life traveling from place to place, doing what was needed to survive, to experience the vastness of the galaxy. He hadn't sought power or control. And yet here he was, sitting across from the most powerful being in the galaxy, someone who had everything, and yet still seemed to lack something that he had always taken for granted. Lyra's gaze softened as she looked at him. "You are different, Marcus. I can see it. And that is why I wanted to speak with you." It was then that Marcus realized just how much more there was to her. The Empress wasn't just a ruler. She wasn't just a face on a throne, commanding fleets and making decisions for billions of people. She was someone who had been shaped by the weight of her responsibilities, someone who had learned that power alone was not enough to find happiness. Marcus had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. This simple traveler who had offered his sandwich to a lonely stranger had unwittingly become part of something much bigger than himself. The days that followed Marcus's invitation aboard the Cerulean Majesty were filled with uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed in ways he couldn't fully understand. One moment he was a simple traveler, drifting from one place to another, and the next, he was sitting across from the ruler of the galaxy, a woman whose power could shake entire star systems. It was difficult for Marcus to reconcile the woman he had met, the one who had accepted his sandwich offer, who had spoken so kindly to him, with the Empress he saw in the media. The Empress, who commanded armies and controlled fleets, whose name was feared across the galaxy. The reality of who she was seemed impossible to grasp. How could someone with so much power also feel so human? But as Marcus spent more time with her, he realized that her humanity wasn't something that could be ignored. Despite the vast empire she ruled, Lyra was a woman who felt trapped in her own position. She had spoken of her loneliness during their dinner together, but Marcus hadn't understood the full weight of it until he saw it in her eyes. The weight of ruling the galaxy was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. She was burdened by responsibilities that no one else could understand. It wasn't long before Marcus began to feel the consequences of his encounter with Lyra. He had thought that their meetings, their conversations, were harmless, but the more time he spent with her, the more the galaxy took notice. News of his casual interactions with the Empress began to spread, and not just through the spaceports and ships. This was the kind of information that reached the highest levels of power. The first indication that things had changed came one afternoon when Marcus received a strange message. It was a quiet, simple communiqué with no official insignia or royal seal, but it carried weight in its simplicity. The message asked him to meet with a group of dignitaries, though it wasn't clear why or under what circumstances. Marcus had received invitations before, but this one felt different. There was an urgency behind it that made his heart race. He went to the meeting, not knowing what to expect. The room was large and austere, with a long table at the center surrounded by tall, dark windows that offered a stunning view of the stars. As he entered, he noticed that the people gathered there were not the usual diplomats or officials. They were more serious, colder in their demeanor. There was an air of tension that Marcus couldn't ignore. The silence that filled the room felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on him. At the head of the table sat a man who looked to be in his mid-50s, his graying hair neatly combed back. His sharp, calculating eyes fixed on Marcus as he entered, his gaze never wavering. The man didn't speak at first, he simply motioned for Marcus to sit. "Welcome," the man said after a long pause. His voice was low and authoritative. "I assume you know why you're here." Marcus took a seat slowly, his palms sweating. "I'm afraid I don't," he admitted, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. The man leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled together. "It's come to our attention that you have formed a connection with Empress Lyra." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who these people were, but it was clear that they knew far too much about him. I don't understand," he stammered. "I've only had a few conversations with her. There's nothing significant about it." The man's lips curled into a small smile, but it was far from reassuring. "You don't understand, Mr. Marcus. Your interactions with the Empress have caused quite a stir. You are not just a traveler anymore. You are a symbol." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "A symbol." "Indeed," the man said, his voice growing colder. "The Empress's actions have consequences, whether she intends them or not. You are now a part of something much larger than yourself." Before Marcus could respond, a woman at the far end of the table spoke up. She was younger than the others, her expression intense. "Do you know what she's doing?" she asked sharply. "She's breaking protocol. She's showing favor to a human, a lowly traveler, while ignoring the very officials who helped her rise to power. That's a dangerous game." The tension in the room thickened, and Marcus felt his mind spinning. He had never meant to be a part of anything bigger. He was just a traveler, a man who had offered a sandwich to a woman sitting alone. How had it escalated to this? "I don't understand," Marcus repeated, his voice steadier now, though confusion still clouded his mind. "Why am I here? What do you want from me?" The man at the head of the table let out a small sigh, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "We want to ensure that the Empress does not make the same mistakes her predecessors made. Her interactions with you, her apparent fondness for you, are a threat to the stability of her rule." Marcus stared at him, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. "You want me to stay away from her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman spoke again, her tone biting. "We want you to do more than that. We need you to leave, to disappear from her life entirely. We are giving you an opportunity to walk away before things get worse." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had no idea that his simple kindness would have such an impact. He had never wanted to be a part of political games, never wanted to be the center of a conflict. All he had done was speak to her as one person to another. The man at the head of the table looked at him with something like pity in his eyes. "You've been warned. The Empress is losing control, and if you continue to be a part of her inner circle, you will be swept up in a storm you cannot survive." It felt like the world was crashing down around Marcus. He had always known that the galaxy was full of politics and power struggles, but he had never expected to be a part of it. He had thought that by showing kindness to someone who seemed lonely, he might make a small difference. But now, it seemed like his actions had set off a chain of events that he couldn't control. He stood up slowly, his head spinning. "I don't want to be a part of any of this," he said firmly, though doubt lingered in his chest. "I didn't ask for any of this." The man's eyes narrowed. "It doesn't matter whether you asked for it or not, you're already involved. And if you care for the Empress at all, you will do what we ask." Marcus didn't say anything else. He left the room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. His footsteps echoed in the hall as he made his way back to his quarters, unsure of what to do next. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Marcus thought about Lyra. He thought about the sadness in her eyes, the weight of her loneliness. She wasn't just a ruler. She was a person, someone who had given him a rare and genuine kindness. But now, it seemed that kindness had put them both in danger. The days that followed were filled with confusion and tension. Marcus couldn't help but feel that his life had been turned upside down. What had started as a simple, random encounter with a lonely woman in a spaceport had spiraled into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. He had never asked for any of this. All he had wanted was to help someone who seemed in need of a kind gesture. But now he was stuck in a political web that he didn't understand, tangled up in the dangerous games of the galactic elite. The meeting with the mysterious dignitaries had left him shaken, and he couldn't stop thinking about their words. They had made it clear, his connection to Empress Lyra was not just a harmless mistake. It was a threat, one that could shake the very foundations of her empire. Marcus had tried to ignore it, tried to go back to his normal life, but the pressure was impossible to escape. It felt as though the galaxy itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a decision. For the first time in his life, he was faced with a choice that didn't have an easy answer. The people who had met with him had made it clear. He needed to leave Lyra's side or risk being swept up in a storm of political chaos. They had threatened him, saying that his presence in her life could bring about her downfall. But Marcus couldn't just walk away. He couldn't turn his back on her, not after everything they had shared. The connection between them wasn't just about politics or power. It was something more, something genuine. Lyra wasn't just the ruler of the galaxy. She was a person who, despite her incredible power, felt more alone than anyone he had ever met. Marcus had spent the last few days in deep thought, trying to make sense of everything. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the Empress needed him. She needed someone who could see her for who she really was, not just as a symbol of authority. Someone who could show her that there was more to life than the weight of a crown. His decision was made. That night he made his way to the royal ship, the Cerulean Majesty, where Lyra was staying. He had arranged the meeting in advance, but now, as he walked toward her chambers, he felt the full weight of the situation. What would she think of him? Would she understand why he was making this choice? When he arrived at her door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. He could hear the soft rustling of movement from inside, and then, after a few moments, the door opened. Lyra stood before him, her violet eyes soft but wary. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at him with an intensity that made Marcus feel as though she were searching for something within him. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." Marcus nodded, swallowing his nerves. He had to say this, he had to be honest with her. "I've been thinking about everything," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "About what's happening, and about us." Lyra stepped back slightly, inviting him in. "Come inside," she said softly, her tone inviting yet filled with the weight of something unsaid. Marcus entered, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The room was bathed in a dim, soft light, the stars outside visible through the large windows. It was quiet, peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of tension between them. "I don't want to make this harder than it already is," Marcus continued. "But I've been warned. There are people who say that if I stay, I'll only cause you more problems. They say I'm a distraction, that I'm a symbol that you can't afford right now." Lyra's eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. She simply listened, waiting for him to continue. "I don't want to cause you harm," Marcus said, his voice almost breaking. "But I can't just leave. I can't turn my back on you now." Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment Marcus saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that told him she understood. "You've become important to me, Marcus," she said quietly, taking a step closer. "You've reminded me of what it means to be human again, what it means to care for someone without power or politics getting in the way." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I never wanted any of this," he admitted, shaking his head. "I never wanted to be part of something like this. I don't belong in your world. I'm just a man who wanted to help." "And that's why you belong here," Lyra said, her voice steady, filled with warmth. "Because you see me for who I truly am, not as an empress, but as a person." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the soft hum of the ship's engines. Marcus felt as if a weight had been lifted from his chest, but there was still a storm brewing in his mind. There were so many consequences to his actions, so many things that could go wrong. He could feel the eyes of the galaxy on him, waiting for him to make a mistake. "I don't know what to do," Marcus said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to stand by you. I don't know if I can handle the pressure." Lyra reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his. Her touch was warm and steady, grounding him in a way that he hadn't felt in years. "You don't have to do anything alone," she said softly. "We can face this together." For a moment, Marcus felt the pull of her words. She was offering him something he had never had, a chance to stand beside someone who truly understood him. He had always been on his own, drifting from one place to another, never staying long enough to build anything meaningful. But now, with Lyra, there was a chance to be part of something larger, something that could make a difference. The thought terrified him, but it also felt right. "I don't know how to navigate all this," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I know I can't walk away from you, not now, not after everything we've shared." Lyra smiled softly, her eyes glistening with something close to relief. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "The galaxy might be watching, but I'm not afraid anymore, not with you by my side." For the first time in days, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. He didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, he knew he had made the right decision. They stood together in silence, their hands entwined, the stars outside casting their soft light across the room. The galaxy may have been a vast, unpredictable place, full of danger and politics, but for Marcus, standing by Lyra felt like the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.